This is Nick Wright with Geopoliticalmonitor.com, here with managing editor Zachary Fillingham on this November 20th, 2018, broadcasting from Toronto, Canada. Now, Zach, on the site, a number of articles that you've published deal with a lot of different issues that seem to be perennial issues that come up time and time again, but it sounds like there's some interesting news for each. So what's new in the world this past week or two that you're particularly interested in?
Well, there's definitely no shortage of interesting topics in the last couple of weeks. I would say that the one of the articles that appeared on the sites this week actually is more something that has fallen off the radar and fallen out of headlines, and I actually sought to bring it back just because not a lot of people were talking about it for a long time. And as you know, it used to be so important, and I'm talking, of course, about U.S. debt. And,
I thought you were going to say Ebola, but yeah, U.S. debt.
No, we'll get to that. But U.S. debt, the Congressional Budget Office recently released some of their projections for long-term debt buildup in the United States. And the report, of course, their report is free. You can go to the CBO and read it. And some of the statistics in it are cited in our Geopolitical Monitor analysis. And it makes for some pretty harrowing reading, particularly the 30-year projection on debt.
It seems like for as long as I can remember, everyone's been concerned about increasing U.S. debt, been saying that horrible things will happen. What's different now? Is this more just kind of ongoing concern without any short-term impact?
I think there's a couple things that are going on now that make it a little different than the past. And you're right. It used to be, particularly when the Democrats were in power, it was the rallying cry of the Republican base. Some things that have changed, some numbers that jump out at you from the CBO report is basically the amount of debt buildup that has taken place since the Great Recession is stark. The accumulation of U.S. debt relative to its GDP is...
And you're talking about, Zach, the 2008 downturn?
2008, 2009. So basically since the Clinton administration, debt has been trending up, and it spiked up further with the Obama administration, which was ushered in right after the Great Recession kicked off. So now you're getting to numbers where... back at the start of the Obama administration, it was around 40%. Now it's getting up to 78%. And if the CBO projections are to be believed, you'd get U.S. debt up to around 150% in 30 years. And those numbers in themselves are not necessarily shocking or remarkable, but what is remarkable is when you get down to the nitty-gritty of the CBO report and you look at how those numbers break down, it's going to create a bit of a political reckoning within U.S. politics on how to deal with it, because the way that their outlays work right now, particularly Social Security, Medicare, and the way they spend on military, which basically eats up most of their non-discretionary budget, something's going to have to change, right? So, long story short, the big thing that's changed here is that the amount of debt accumulation that has taken place within the last 10 years is going to start up to show up in a very real way in terms of annual interest payments, which is going to start to eat into the U.S. budget. And another reason why, in a more international sense, which is something that we get into more in the article on Geopolitical Monitor, is that obviously the U.S. dollar and U.S. treasuries have kind of been the gold standard, for lack of a better word, of international finance in the post-gold standard era, where governments around the world use them as sort of a benchmark of their own financial stability. As the U.S. debt situation becomes more tenuous going forward, we might see that kind of thinking reevaluated.
Now, so long as there's the petrodollar, so long as people who are buying oil have to purchase it in USD, Will there be any change? Can't the government just continue to print money and expand its debt without any real concern?
I would say so long as this is going on, there probably will be little change. But sooner or, it's always hard to foresee a kind of paradigm shift when you're living in that bubble. But sooner or later, it stands to reason that system will have to change. And you're seeing, the petrodollar system, and you're seeing the early indications of baby steps already in sort of the increasing prevalence of bilateral settlement vehicles between two states to settle their energy purchases in their own local currencies. You're also seeing it in, for example, the European Union trying to grapple with how to save the Iranian nuclear deal, given Trump's new sanctions, and the sort of discussions that are starting to happen in Europe about how to disentangle that continent from its over-reliance on the U.S. financial system. So these are down the road. All I'm saying is that, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that this will happen. It's certainly very possible, and the sort of debt accumulation that we see in the CBO projections are the sort of thing that will precipitate this change, or at least contribute to this change.
Now, President Trump has talked about cutting taxes, some of which has been implemented, and also about reducing American expenditures, or at least requiring other countries to contribute more for international military organizations and exercises. So I was wondering, how does the debt break down? How much is domestic spending on social programs? How much is due to tax cuts in recent years? And how much is military spending? And moving forward, where do you think the funds will come from to either reduce that deficit or to make up for the shortfall?
Well, we at Geopolitical Monitor don't like to delve too deeply into domestic politics in any country. We kind of keep it international, but the United States, given its importance, is often an exception in this. In a sort of general speculatory way, myself, I would think that the way that politics are playing out right now, the more cynical among us might conclude that the Republicans are setting up a bit of a reckoning down the line in terms of U.S. finances. So they're creating a situation that's effectively untenable for future governments. And the question is going to be what those future governments do about it. You mentioned the tax cut. The tax cut itself obviously is going to impact government revenues in a major way. And those income tax cuts are set to expire in 2026, I believe. So this, basically a future government's going to have to deal with that. They're going to have to be the government that basically effectively raises taxes, right? By letting those tax cuts expire. And in the CBO report, they specifically say that if those tax cuts are left in place, then the projections are going to be considerably worse over 30 years. So, you're going to have, to answer your question, you're going to have a situation where you need to cut Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. Those are going to be targets. If you're on the Republican end, you're going to see pressure on the military budget, presumably. And obviously that's going to play out in broader U.S. foreign policy. As we can see with the Trump era, the writing's already on the wall. There's been a move away from the adventurism of that we saw born in the Clinton, Bush, Obama era. And really, when you look back at that from purely a fiscal point of view, that's a tragedy for U.S. finances because those wars together were incredibly expensive for the U.S. government.
Indeed, and that's something we don't really hear much of. There's not much discussion of the cost of those wars.
Yeah, I mean the famous comparison that's always floated is that the war in Afghanistan is now comparable to the Marshall Plan post World War II. And when you think of what, in a geopolitical sense, the United States got from the Marshall Plan, and then you compare it to what they are getting from Afghanistan. It's a depressing comparison.
Interesting. So what other topics are of note?
You brought it up before. I think Ebola is flying a little bit under the radar for the international news lately, which is kind of interesting because it was so much of a huge issue, the last outbreak in West Africa. And really, when you look at the specific conditions of this outbreak, there's a lot more to be worried about.
And is this something we should actually be concerned about? It seems like you said, such a big deal was made about it before. Nothing came of it. It seems to be an ongoing issue. Is this something that would affect people outside of sub-Saharan Africa in a meaningful and widespread way?
I think that it always has the potential to affect people, and you really don't know who will be affected or where the effects will be felt. Obviously, you're looking at sort of concentric circles of impact away from the outbreak zone, the most immediate concern being the Democratic Republic of Congo and the surrounding area. I think that from a pure risk assessment point of view, there are aspects of this outbreak that are a lot more alarming than the last outbreak, and there's always a bit of a risk of thinking that because the last outbreak, particularly with disease, because the last outbreak sort of came to nothing outside of West Africa. Obviously, it was financially a humanitarian disaster for the countries involved. But when you look at the wider world, sitting comfortably in North America, Europe, wasn't a major impact for us. I don't think that necessarily that's always going to be the case, particularly because when you look at all outbreaks of Ebola in the past in Africa, most of them tend to be in hinterlands and, disconnected from the, or separate from the growing connectivity of the African continent, like the growing prevalence of fast infrastructure, modern amenities that allow people to travel very quickly, allow for the potential of someone who's infected to move, far, infecting different clusters of population along the way. That kind of situation hasn't happened yet, right? You haven't had someone who's taken a plane from one end of the continent to the other and infected several people along the way who have in turn gone to other places. We haven't seen that yet. Hopefully we will continue not to see that.
And how much of that is chance and how much of it is now more effective practices by the World Health Organization and other bodies that are
sorry.
Go ahead.
A lot of it's chance. A lot of it's the chance that the fact that these have originally broken out in sort of difficult to reach places. The one that we're seeing now in the DRC is doubly challenging for the health authorities because not only is it in somewhat of a hinterland, but it's also, it's Tripoli. It's also in a state that has no real effective government institutional infrastructure. No effective health system with which the international health authorities can piggyback on and supplement. It's also in a section of the DRC that is, like many sections of the DRC, prone to instability and rebel attacks. Particularly, there's the ADF, the Allied Democratic Forces, that originally was a rebel group, an Islamist rebel group out of Uganda that has crossed the border and now operates in and around the city of Beni, which the outbreak is centered on. And we've seen lots of attacks on health workers, and it has seriously frustrated the ability of the health authorities to mount an effective response. And in the latest situation reports out of the World Health Organization, we're seeing, intensification of the outbreak around the epicenter, and we're also seeing some geographic spread around the area. So now it's moving closer to Uganda. It's moving upwards to South Sudan. I mean, it's still early days, still very few cases sort of moving outward, but it is still, in an overall sense, a little troubling to see.
And what impact, if any, has the more recent round of outbreaks or the previous round had on regional relations and geopolitics?
Well, I think that you never really... I mean, unfortunately, not much. I would say one thing about this outbreak, one other thing I'd like to add about this outbreak is that there are actual effective vaccines now, like experimental vaccines that have been approved for use. And it's still challenging to get them out there because they require refrigeration, and you're going places without roads and electricity. But that might be another reason why people are being lulled into a false sense of security on this front. When we're talking about geopolitical relations, regional relations within Africa, I don't think that Ebola has much of an impact because, I mean, Ebola should just be considered a humanitarian disaster like any other. It's more restricted to the immediate economic impact of the states involved. And of course, those economic impact can have knock-on effects, like if it creates a situation of destitution, people moving, which is always potentially destabilizing. But I think that if we're talking about the West African outbreak from before, there haven't been, many sort of large-scale, notable regional implications.
Now, Zac, on the site Geopoliticalmonitor.com, I noticed that you've been covering Brexit quite intensely. So what's the latest with Brexit?
Yeah, Brexit has been another topic that shows up all the time on the website because of its obvious import, potentially, to global politics and the global economy. We're kind of in the end phase of Brexit, finally.
How will this most recent proposal be any different than how it was prior to Brexit?
Well, it's not going to be that different. And I think that some people within the Conservative Party have taken offense to just how little difference there will be. I think that the United Kingdom will regain some... And also, I should say this. The details are scant. The whole thing has been vague from the start, and a lot of the deal is contingent to another deal that will be negotiated after the official Brexit date, which will sort of finalize the details of the UK's future trading relationship with the EU. So there are some things that are still left to be worked out, but I mean, it looks like they will remain in a customs union together because of the Ireland's border issue. And that flies contrary to a lot of the pledges that were being thrown around by the Brexiters about regaining regulatory authority over the UK's economy. And there remains no easy out there.
And can you elaborate on Ireland's role and the issue that's arisen due to their
Ireland? I mean, there are a couple of things about Brexit that were apparent from the start, and some really sticky issues that were apparent from the start. And the UK has often sought to sort of gloss over them, probably with the intention of trying to get the EU to shift their position. But I think everybody kind of knew that on certain things like Ireland, the EU was never going to budge. And so the problem with Ireland is you have the Good Friday agreements, which ended the troubles in Ireland. And part of the Good Friday agreements, obviously the troubles was a period of terrorism and instability in Ireland, centered around the IRA and other groups. And the Good Friday Agreement, part of it is to basically have no border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So there would be free movement of people, goods, etc. Obviously, if Brexit were to proceed and the United Kingdom were to leave the EU customs unit, that would cause a border to be thrown up between Northern Ireland and Ireland, which would breach the Good Friday Agreements. In extremis, maybe even bring back the violence of the Troubles, but more immediately, it would precipitate a sure veto from the Republic of Ireland on the final Brexit agreement, because that is definitely a red line that government would be unwilling to cross. So that was just one of the many hurdles that were sort of there from the start.
One other question, Zach, is in the article there's a discussion of Britain's so-called divorce bill for separating. What does that look like, and what are some of the costs and expenses that Britain will have to cover under the proposed agreement?
Oh, well, yeah, that was another thing that that some of the Theresa May's Conservative party members were not happy about. Basically, the divorce bill is just trying to, the exact figure escapes me right now. It's in the tens of billions of pounds. And I think 35-ish is the number that sticks in my head. It's basically the amount of money it takes for Britain to extricate itself from the EU budget, all of the communal programs that it contributed to, right? And
so who would be getting this money? The European Union?
European Union. And another aspect of the Brexit agreement on the table now that is causing a lot of anger in the Conservative establishment, the pro-Brexit establishment in the United Kingdom, is the fact that the UK will continue to contribute to the EU budget for several years from now. And like, if you'll recall, one of the main pledges of the pro-Leave campaign was that we're going to stop giving this money to the EU and we're going to put it into the NHS, hence their famous bus.
There's a lot of turmoil in the UK.
Yeah.
So what about...
it makes for very interesting political drama, that's for sure.
Yeah, really. So what about Goldman Sachs in Malaysia?
This is another interesting one that's kind of flying under the radar. So basically, last year, and this is also something we covered on Geopolitical Monitor, last year there were general elections. Actually, earlier this year, sorry. There were general elections in Malaysia. And they unseated the long-term Prime Minister Najib and replaced him with the old authoritarian leader Mahathir. And it was basically a totally moonshot win for Mahathir, who's a previous authoritarian, came out of retirement, joined together with his former nemesis, Anwar Ibrahim, who he had Mahathir had manufactured this politician's downfall. He joins forces with him, and together they managed to unseat the prime minister, who basically had created a situation threw up all sorts of hurdles in terms of advertising at the voting booth. Basically, it was a totally uphill battle that no one expected them to win, the opposition to win, right? So the centerpiece of this election is this thing called 1MDB, which is like a corporate development vehicle. You can think of it as sort of a development fund, right? And this fund, 1MDB, had billions of dollars, raised billions of dollars, was involved in major development projects, mainly the terminal for a new high-speed rail between Singapore and Malaysia. And it turns out that a whole lot of money was stolen from 1MDB, maybe upwards to $6.5 billion. It is a lot of money. And it was discovered initially by the U.S. Justice Department, an investigation by the U.S. Justice Department. But there had been a lot of, rumblings obviously within Malaysian society, and there were a lot of troubled, like all these projects under the 1MDB umbrella were extremely troubled. They were delayed, they were coming in substandard, et cetera, et cetera. So it was obviously money was going missing. It's just people didn't know how much. So Mahathir wins the election, right? And immediately, I think the assumption, obviously, as I was saying, it's very surprising that they won the election. And I think the assumption was that the previous prime minister was going to stay in power, and since he was allegedly so implicated in this 1MDB graft, he was going to continue to be able to shield all those involved, and there would be no prosecutions, right? So he loses the election, and everyone's like, oh God, oh no. Some people disappear, some people run away, some people stick around, they've been arrested, and it continues to unfold, right? Classically, I think the previous prime minister was found to have, I think, around $600 million unaccounted money in his bank account, which appears to be, allegedly, from 1MDB, right? Or some such graft, right? And he says his defense is that it was a gift from the Saudi royal family, which in itself, not much of a defense, I would think, right? Because why is the Saudi royal family giving you $600 million? Anyways, sorry, I digress. So Goldman Sachs was the bank that helped raise money for 1MDB. So they, through a series of bond issuances in 2013, 2014, they raised billions of dollars for 1MDB. Obviously, that money ultimately is stolen, right? So they made about $650 million on the bond issuances, which is, I'm told, a abnormally large amount of fees to go to the bank to, So anyways, this article that's up on the website right now, it explores the one of Goldman Sachs' top bankers in South Asia. He's gone down he's basically pled guilty for being involved in that, in buying off certain Malaysian politicians to be able to get the 1MDB deal, right? So obviously that kind of activity is illegal, but there's an open question as to whether this was just one banker and whether whether it's just one instance, whether there was other illicit activity that was going on surrounding 1MDB.
And is there likely to be any impact for Goldman Sachs as a result of this?
Oh, there's already impact. I think their stocks are down around 11%. And they're being interviewed by Justice Department officials. The Justice Department is taking the lead on the 1MDB investigation. Also, I would say one thing, I don't think any of us really expect Goldman Sachs to, they were talking about the possibility, some were talking about the possibility of the bank's license being revoked in the United States. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think anyone really expects that to happen with this current political climate in the States. However, I think that there's going to be sustained political will in Malaysia for the next couple of years to investigate 1MDB to the fullest extent. So I think in that sense, it's possible that we might see interesting new disclosures about this huge, colossal graft, not just about Goldman Sachs, but about other players who were involved.
So likely have ramifications in Malaysia for quite some time to come.
Oh, definitely. You can't overstate this, just how surprising this election win was. And 1MDB was, it's an interesting case. It's interesting for the domestic context for Malaysia. It's interesting that it's the Department of Justice taking the lead in the investigation. It's interesting where all this money goes. I mean, the money ends up, there's the Justice Department is trying to get the assets back, like trying to track the money and then get the money back and then give the money back to Malaysia. It all goes into luxury properties, pieces of art, etc. And it all just speaks to the problem of global money laundering that exists in our world, not just to do with Malaysia, to do with many places, to do with the countries where the money is stolen and the countries where the money is hidden. So it's basically the West and everyone. This is a problem, and it also speaks to the sort of competing development models that exist in the world today. One championed by China, sort of symbolized by Belt and Road, which is a soft touch.
And how does that differ from the West's version?
Well, the Chinese approach is to it's a soft touch, right? So very little transparency. You don't always know what the actual content of the contracts. There is no legal demands to there's no legal prerogative to avoid the sort of greased palms, etc. Like, for example, in the UK, United States, there are actually laws that these banks and these companies have to technically adhere to, right? They don't always do, but technically they do. They need to. So in a way, the Chinese there's benefits to the Chinese approach in the sense of quote unquote getting things done, because you can circumvent all these controls. You just go right past them. If you get to the centers of power in the country that you're dealing with, you can make things happen. And as we point out in a lot of the stuff we do about Belt and Road, I mean, there's a lot of negative press about Belt and Road, but I think that you always got to keep in mind, if Belt and Road wasn't around, then there's no finance, right? I mean, China gets such favorable terms for their loans because in many cases there's no competition for them, right? So it's not like an island nation like Vanuatu has much of a choice. But so there's that aspect in the Chinese, and then the Western approach technically is more oversight, more transparency, and technically more of an eye towards the overall economic feasibility and long-term, like whether or not this project has any sort of long-term stability impact, right?
So I think talking about China is a good segue into North Korea and the developments in North Korea and the impact that China, the US, and other powers are having on it. So what's the news with North Korea?
Well, North Korea, it's all bad news. North Korea is, I think anyone who's sort of watched the North Korea issue over the long term are amazed by what's going on. Mostly, they're amazed by it, but they're not surprised by it, right? Because I think if you're designing a negotiating strategy for North Korea, you would take all of this behavior as a given. This behavior being this sort of duplicity from the North Korean side, the desire to sort of stretch out the process, extract any concessions possible, without nailing themselves down to having to give up anything. It's kind of been this way for the whole history of North Korean negotiations, ever since the 1990s. I think that the difference with Donald Trump, the Trump administration, is that there's a great deal of political will at the very top of the U.S. administration to make this into a success.
And why is that? Why is Donald Trump so interested in North Korea as an issue?
I don't know. I think it's difficult to know what is going on all the time with the Trump administration. And also like where the decision making is coming from. What I do know is that if you were to just analyze diplomacy in a purely interpersonal way, I think that you would find Donald Trump obviously has some kind of attraction to certain authoritarian personality type. It seems like he views them as kindred spirits. And I think he likes the perceived ability to move an issue forward by force of his own individual will. And obviously summit diplomacy is a great format for that. So you can go, and this is all very obvious in the Singapore summit, where it's kind of like play acting. You get the impression you get the feeling of really solving the problem, but obviously when the summit's over, it becomes apparent that the problem remains.
And how much control does China have? Is China influencing North Korea from behind the scenes to advance its geopolitical ambitions?
I don't think so. I think that China's position towards North Korea has been the same for a long time. Basically, it wants to keep it as a buffer state between the South Korean government that does house U.S. military bases, which is a serious security consideration for China. But it wants to maintain that buffer state. It doesn't want that buffer state to collapse, which would create sort of calamitous refugee situation and super unpredictable scenario for all stakeholders involved. I think that it's always hard to tell exactly just how much China and to a lesser degree Russia are actually enforcing the sanctions, but indications over the last year or so leading up to the trade war were that they were doing a pretty good job compared to historical examples enforcing the sanctions. Now that has since changed, and sanction enforcement seems to be relaxing. But I mean, it's up in the air. That could have something to do with the trade war, obviously, because you don't really want to play ball with someone who's screwing you. But it could also have to do with the fact that it could also do with the Singapore summit itself, because President Trump went to Singapore and he set off all sorts of like mission accomplished signals, right? It doesn't really create a sense of urgency for China and Russia in terms of enforcing the sanctions, because the overwhelming message from Singapore was that like mission accomplished, threat is over. So,
but instead it seems like more of the same that's been going on for many, many years.
It was always, and this is another thing to keep in mind. I mean, it was always going to be more of the same, right? So when you view North Korea, you always need to be realistic about your expectations. And one of those one aspect of being realistic about your expectations is the knowledge that back in the day when it was the height of bluster from both sides and Trump was openly threatening war, the knowledge that the military option is incredibly unappealing. In fact, the military option is all but off the table. So that's one thing. The second thing is being realistic about the way that the North Koreans will act in the negotiating process, and that will be you don't never give them anything for nothing, which is what Donald Trump did when he canceled the joint exercises with Korea, and when he held the summit to begin with, right? Because the summit was long sought after by the North Korean government. Because when you go to a summit with the United States, you show those images back home. It creates incredible legitimacy for the regime. I mean, it's a huge win for the North Koreans. So being I think that the realistic appraisal of the situation is that it's going to be a difficult grind. Success is not guaranteed, but if you do get anything out of it, it's going to be something that appears pretty much perpetuation of the status quo, which is no war, hopefully reduced nuclear capacity for North Korea, and expecting anything else is unrealistic. Like the expectation, I mean, to have an interesting hypothetical conversation, if you were the North Korean government, would you denuclearize?
Most certainly not.
Exactly. Like, if you were to approach it from a rational standpoint, of course they're not going to denuclearize.
Although that said, I think there is a lot of opportunity for opening up to the world, reducing some of the horrible atrocities that the regime commits, and in effect modernizing without putting their country and nation militarily at risk.
True, and that is often floated as the sort of best case scenario. People will present the Chinese example as, Chinese reform and opening as a great example of the benefits of sort of economic reforms without political reforms. But I would also say to them, the North Korean system and the Chinese system are very different, at least up until Xi Jinping, or at least reform era Chinese system. Up until Xi Jinping, there were conventions in political transition within the Communist Party, right? Like we don't see it, but behind closed doors, there's jockeying, there's consensus building. There was the informal rule of only standing on for 2 terms, that sort of thing. So you had a bit of a political process, a bit of political plurality, albeit behind closed doors. I don't know if North Korea's, essentially it's a dynasty, right? I don't know if North Korea's dynasty could survive opening. And they might be aware of that. In fact, it would definitely be something they would be concerned about.
Interesting. Well, thanks so much, Zac. It's been really enlightening. I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to start doing these audio podcasts and YouTube broadcasts. I think it'll be great. It's the first of what we hope will be many such recordings. Yeah,
thank you.
And to our listeners, you can go to Geopoliticalmonitor.com to read articles on all the topics that we've been discussing, and for future articles that will follow these issues on an ongoing basis. So again, it's Nick Wright here with Zachary Fillingham for Geopoliticalmonitor.com. Talk to you next time.